In today's video, we're stepping back into the 1940s to experience what life was really like for the average US soldier, from brutal training, camps and harsh battlefield conditions, to fear, exhaustion, and the small moments that kept men going. This isn't just about famous battles or heroic speeches, it's about survival. As you watch, think about how you would handle it. Would you make it through basic training? Could you endure the cold, hunger, and constant danger? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We love reading them. If you enjoy calm, immersive history like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And when this video ends, check out the other World War II and historical survival stories on the channel. They're perfect for relaxing, learning, and drifting into the past. Imagine waking up before dawn in a freezing tent, your boots still wet from yesterday, your stomach empty, and the distant sound of artillery rolling across the horizon. No pause button, no second chances, just orders, uncertainty, and the hope that you make it through the day. Could you survive as an American soldier in World War II? Now, take a breath, and let's find out if you could survive World War II. Before there was a uniform, before the rifle and the helmet and the long sea crossing, there was just ordinary life. America, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, did not feel like a country about to fight the largest war in human history. It felt tired. It felt careful. It felt like a place that had already been through enough. The Great Depression still lingered in quiet ways. Even when the economy began to improve, many families did not trust that improvement would last. People saved string. They reused envelopes. They fixed things instead of replacing them. A broken radio might sit silent for months before anyone could afford to repair it. For many young men who would soon become soldiers, life was already physically demanding. On farms, the day began before sunrise. Hands were rough, backs ached early in life. In factories, shifts were long and loud. Machines filled the air with heat and metal noise. The work was repetitive, but steady work was something to be grateful for. Survival, in a quiet way, was already a skill. Daily routines was simple. Breakfast was quick. Lunch was packed or skipped. Supper was the main meal, eaten together if possible. After dinner, people sat near the radio. This small wooden box was the center of the home. It brought music, comedy, baseball games, and news from faraway places most Americans would never see. Europe existed mainly as a voice on the radio. Names like Poland, France, and Germany sounded distant and complicated. Asia felt even farther. China and Japan were words, not places. Too many Americans, the world beyond the ocean felt like someone else's problem. Newspapers carried headlines about war, but they were read alongside ads for shoes, soap, and used cars. The war was serious, but it did not yet feel personal. It was something that happened over there, a phrase people used often, and with comfort. There was also memory. World War I was not ancient history. Fathers, uncles, and neighbors still remembered it. They remembered mud, gas masks, and letters that stopped arriving. That memory made many Americans cautious. They did not rush toward another war. They leaned away from it. Isolation felt safer. In small towns, life moved slowly. The same people passed each other on the same streets every day. Everyone knew who worked where, who was sick, and who still owed money at the hardware store. Big events were rare, which made them important. A high school football game could be the highlight of the week. A county fair could be remembered for years. In cities, life was louder but still predictable. Streetcars ran on schedule. Factory whistles marked time. People knew when their shift started and when it ended. There was comfort in routine. It made the future feel manageable. Very few people imagined themselves as soldiers. Even fewer imagined themselves in combat. Young men thought about work, about marriage, about leaving town someday, or maybe never leaving at all. Some dreamed of adventure, but most dreamed of stability, a steady job, a family, a house that did not need repairs every winter. The idea of survival meant surviving life, not bullets. Radio shows offered escape. Comedy programs made people laugh at simple jokes. Nothing too sharp, nothing too loud. Just enough humor to soften the edges of the day. Music drifted through living rooms at night, slow and familiar. These sounds would later follow soldiers overseas in memory, replaying in their heads when everything else felt strange. There was also a strong belief that America was protected by distance. Two wide oceans felt like walls. Many believed that war could not easily cross them. History seemed to support that idea. Geography felt like armor. That belief would not survive December 1941. But before that moment, before the shock and the headlines and the speeches, there was calm. Not perfect calm, but a steady one. Life continued. People planned weddings. Children went to school. Men went to work without thinking about uniforms. This calm is important to understand, because when the war came, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It interrupted something. It cut into routines that had taken years to rebuild after economic collapse. It pulled people away from lives that were ordinary, grounded, and unfinished. Many of the men who would later land on beaches or march through ruined towns had never left their home state. Some had never left their county. Foreign countries were not just foreign. They were unimaginable. Even the military itself felt distant. The US Army before the war was relatively small. Service was something a few people chose, not something everyone expected. Soldiers were professionals, not neighbors. That separation created a sense of disbelief when change finally came. When news from Europe grew darker, people listened, nodded, and went back to their lives. When reports from the Pacific mentioned fighting, they sounded like someone else's story. Tragic, yes. Urgent, maybe, but still far away. There was no countdown clock hanging in the air. Looking back, it is easy to imagine that everyone sensed what was coming. They did not. History always feels louder in hindsight. At the time, it whispered, "This matters for survival because survival does not start when the shooting begins. It starts with what you know, what you expect, and what you believe about the world." American soldiers would enter the war carrying assumptions shaped by this quiet life. Assumptions about safety, about fairness, about how quickly things would make sense. War would challenge all of that. But here, in this moment before the uniform, life was still intact, still recognizable, still slow enough to feel normal. This was the world American soldiers came from. Not a nation eager for battle, but one still hoping it could avoid it. And that makes the next moment, when everything changes, feel heavier, because no one had trained for what came next. Not really, and certainly not emotionally. In the next chapter, that quiet life will be interrupted by a single piece of paper, and from that moment on, survival will stop being theoretical. It will become personal. It usually arrived without drama, no trumpet sound, no marching band, just a plain envelope, light in the hand, heavy in meaning. For many young men, the draft notice showed up mixed in with regular mail, bills, advertisements, a letter from a cousin. It did not announce itself as life-changing. It looked official, but not dramatic. Just paper, ink, instructions. Some opened it, standing by the mailbox. Others carried it inside and set it on the table, letting it sit there for a while. A few waited until after supper. There was no right way to read it. The words were simple and direct. You were being called. You were expected to report. The date and place were clear. Everything else was uncertain. This was often the moment when the war stopped being distant. Until then, Europe and the Pacific were radio voices, headlines, maps with arrows. Now the war had an address, and that address was yours. Reactions varied, but silence was common. Families did not always talk much after the letter was opened. There was no script for this. Some fathers nodded, having once worn a uniform themselves. Some mothers turned back to whatever they were doing, because stopping felt worse. Younger siblings watched quietly, sensing that something important had happened, but not fully understanding what it meant. Fear was there, but it did not always show itself clearly. It hid behind responsibility, behind phrases like "doing your part" and "this is how it is." Duty became a way to make fear feel respectable. The draft did not ask if you were ready. It did not ask if you were brave. It did not ask if you had plans. Selection often felt random. Two friends could grow up side by side, same school, same job, and only one would be called. Another might be deferred for work deemed essential. Someone else might fail a medical exam. These differences were small on paper and enormous in real life. Luck entered the story early. For many men, this was the first time they felt truly powerless over their future. Jobs could be quit, towns could be left, but the draft did not negotiate. It did not care how settled your life felt. Survival, in this phase, was emotional. Some men tried to act unaffected. They joked about it, made comments about finally seeing the world. Humor helped, a little. It also confused people around them, who were not sure whether to laugh or worry. Others became quiet, thoughtful. They started noticing things they had never paid attention to before. The sound of the house at night, the way light hit the kitchen table. These details suddenly felt important, though no one could explain why. There were practical matters to handle, jobs to leave, belongings to pack, affairs to settle in a rushed and imperfect way. Employers shook hands and wished luck. Some promised that jobs would be waiting when the war was over. No one knew if that promise could be kept. Goodbyes were often awkward. There were no long speeches, no dramatic last words. Most people did not know how to say goodbye to something undefined. You might be gone for months, or years, or not come back at all. Saying too much made that possibility feel too real, so people said very little. A mother might straighten a collar that did not need straightening. A father might offer advice that had nothing to do with war. Write when you can, eat when you're able, as if food and letters could control fate. Some men felt a strange sense of relief mixed with fear. The waiting was over. The uncertainty had shape now. There was a date, a place, a direction. Others felt resentment, not always toward the war itself, but toward the randomness of it, toward the idea that someone else's life would continue unchanged while theirs was being paused or redirected entirely. This resentment was rarely spoken aloud. Publicly, the language was respectful, patriotic, even restrained. Open resistance was uncommon early on. The weight of social expectation was heavy. No one wanted to be the one who did not go, and so most went. The first step was usually a physical exam. Long lines, stripped down, measured, weighed, prodded. It was impersonal and uncomfortable. Bodies were evaluated quickly, sometimes carelessly. A doctor's decision could change everything in seconds. Those who passed were given dates to report for training. This was when survival quietly shifted from imagination to preparation. Men began to think about what they could control. Physical strength, endurance. Some tried to get in better shape. Others simply continued their routines, not knowing what would matter later and what would not. There was very little information about where they might be sent. Europe, Africa, the Pacific, or somewhere else entirely. Most did not know the difference between these places beyond weather and rumors. Uncertainty followed them like a shadow. At night, thoughts came more easily. Questions without answers. What would combat be like? Would training be enough? Would fear take over? These questions rarely had words. They existed as feelings, heavy and unresolved. The idea of survival was still abstract. People thought about not dying, of course, but they did not yet understand how many other things survival would include. Hunger, cold, loneliness, waiting, the slow wearing down of the mind. Those lessons had not arrived yet. For now, survival meant showing up on time, filling out forms correctly, saying goodbye without falling apart. In many ways, this moment was the last time life felt simple. After this, decisions would be made by others. Schedules would be assigned. Orders would be followed. Control would shrink. The draft notice did not just change where a person would be, it changed how much choice they had. And for the first time, many young Americans realized that survival was no longer something assumed. It was something that would have to be earned, quietly, day by day. In the next chapter, that earning begins, in a place designed to break down civilians and rebuild them into something else. Whether it succeeds is another question entirely. Training began with confusion. Men arrived at camps carrying suitcases that suddenly felt useless. Civilian clothes were taken away. Hair was cut short, sometimes unevenly, sometimes without much care. Names were replaced with numbers. Individual habits disappeared quickly. The army did not have time for them. Days started early, very early. Before sunrise, before the body felt ready. A whistle or a shout pulled men from sleep that had barely settled. There was no easing into the morning. You were awake because you had to be. Boot camp focused on the body first. Running, marching, crawling, lifting, repeating the same movements until muscles burned and lungs protested. Physical exhaustion was not a side effect. It was the point. Tired men followed orders faster. Tired men asked fewer questions. Many recruits arrived already used to hard work, but this was different. Farm labor and factory shifts were demanding, but they had rhythm. Training did not. It pushed when the body wanted rest and stopped just when momentum began to build. Meals were quick. Lines moved fast. Food was basic and functional, enough to keep men going, not enough to be enjoyed. Some joked that it was designed to teach appreciation for worse meals later. No one knew how true that would be. Drill instructors filled the air with noise. Commands were sharp. Corrections were constant. Mistakes were public. The goal was precision, but also pressure. Learning to perform under stress mattered more than learning perfectly. Punishment was common. sometimes deserved, sometimes not. Push-ups, extra laps, standing at attention until legs shook. It taught obedience, but it also taught something quieter. That fairness was not guaranteed. Weapons training followed. Rifles were introduced with seriousness, but often without much time. There were many men to train and not enough hours. Recruits learned how to load, aim, fire, and clean their weapons. They practiced on ranges with clear targets and known distances. Targets did not shoot back. This was a limitation no one fully addressed. Combat was loud, chaotic, and unpredictable. Training tried to simulate this, but it could only go so far. Blank ammunition and shouted commands could not recreate fear. Some men were good shots, others were not. Accuracy mattered, but survival would later depend on many things unrelated to marksmanship. That lesson was not taught directly. There was little discussion of the mind. Fear was not explained. Panic was not rehearsed. No one sat recruits down and said, "This is what terror feels like, and this is how you move through it." Instead, fear was treated as something that would sort itself out. The assumption was simple. Training would carry you through. For some, it did. For others, it did not. Injuries happened early. Twisted ankles, pulled muscles, heat exhaustion. Some men were sent home before ever leaving the country. Others pushed through injuries that never fully healed. There was pressure to keep going. No one wanted to be the one who could not handle it. Illness spread easily. Crowded barracks, shared equipment, coughs echoed at night. Fevers were ignored when possible. Reporting sick sometimes meant falling behind, and falling behind was dangerous in its own way. Despite everything, routines formed. Men learned when to move quickly and when to conserve energy. They learned how to stand in line without thinking. They learned how to pack and unpack gear efficiently. Small efficiencies mattered. They saved seconds, and seconds felt valuable. Camaraderie developed quietly. Shared exhaustion bonded people faster than conversation ever could. Jokes were made at odd moments, often when things were worst. Humor became a tool, not for happiness, but for endurance. There was laughter, but it was tired laughter. Letters from home arrived irregularly. When they did, they were read and reread. Familiar handwriting grounded men in a world that already felt distant. Some letters tried to be cheerful. Others tried to sound normal. Both felt strange. Time passed strangely in training. Days felt long. Weeks passed quickly. The future hovered just out of sight. Everyone knew training was temporary, but no one knew what came next. The idea of survival shifted again here. At first, survival meant keeping up physically, not falling behind on marches, not collapsing during drills, not being singled out as weak. These things felt important, and in a way, they were. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Men were learning to follow orders automatically, to move when told, to stop when told, to trust that someone else knew what was happening, even when it did not feel that way. This trust would later be tested. Training did not prepare men for everything. It could not. It taught discipline, not understanding, endurance, not resilience, strength, not recovery. When recruits were told they were ready, many believed it. Others doubted quietly. There was no test that truly measured readiness for combat. There never could be. The body had been trained. The mind had been left to adapt on its own. And yet, this training was still necessary. It gave structure. It gave shared language. It gave something to fall back on when thinking stopped working. As training ended, rumors began. Where units might be sent. Who might ship out first. Which theater was worse. Europe or the Pacific. Cold or heat. Bullets or disease. No one agreed. Orders eventually came. There was a final inspection. Gear was issued. Papers were signed. Training camps emptied as quickly as they had filled. The men leaving were not the same ones who had arrived. They were stronger, thinner, more tired, more aware of hierarchy, less attached to individual comfort. They had learned to endure discomfort without complaint, but they had not yet learned how fragile that endurance could be. That lesson would come later. Training had done what it could. It had shaped bodies into soldiers. What it had not done was prepare them for the weight they were about to carry, both on their backs and in their minds. In the next chapter, that weight becomes literal. The uniform goes on, the equipment is issued, and for the first time, many soldiers begin to understand that survival will not be light, fast, or easy. It will be heavy, and it will stay that way for a long time. The uniform came first. It was handed out in pieces, not all at once. Shirts, pants, jackets, boots, each item stamped, sized, and issued with efficiency. There was nothing ceremonial about it. No moment where someone said, "This is who you are now." You simply put it on because that was the next step. At first, the uniform felt stiff. The fabric was rough in places, seams rubbed, boots needed breaking in, and until they made sure you noticed every step. The helmet felt awkward, like it did not quite belong on your head. Still, there was a sense of transformation. Looking around, everyone now looked the same. Differences faded quickly. Age, background, personality, all blurred under olive drab. This sameness was intentional. It made individuals easier to manage. It also made loss easier to replace, though no one said that out loud. Then came the equipment. This was when the weight arrived. Each soldier was issued what the army believed he needed to survive and fight. A rifle or carbine, ammunition, a helmet, a pack, a shovel, a canteen, extra clothing, sometimes grenades, sometimes additional gear, depending on role and unit. Individually, none of it seemed overwhelming. Together, it added up fast. The full load could easily reach 60 pounds or more, sometimes much more. It rested on shoulders, hips, and backs that were already tired from training. Straps cut into skin, packs shifted when marching. The rifle was always there, bumping against the body, reminding you not to forget it. Marches with full gear were slower. Every step required effort. Hills felt steeper. Heat felt heavier. Even standing still became work. The body had to constantly balance and adjust. This was not just inconvenient, it mattered for survival. Heavy equipment slowed movement. It reduced reaction time. It made quick decisions physically harder to execute. Dropping gear was sometimes necessary, but that choice came with risk. What you left behind, you might need later. Helmets offered protection, but they were not perfect. They could stop shrapnel and glancing blows, but not everything. They also limited hearing and vision. Some soldiers adjusted how they wore them. Others removed them whenever they thought it was safe. Boots were critical. A bad pair could end a soldier's effectiveness quickly. Blisters became infections. Wet boots stayed wet. Cold made everything worse. Foot care became a quiet obsession. Those who ignored it paid for it later. The rifle was both comfort and burden. It meant defense. It also meant responsibility. It had to be cleaned constantly. Dirt, moisture, and neglect could turn it into dead weight. Soldiers learned quickly that a weapon was only as reliable as the care given to it. There was little room for personal choice in issued gear, but soldiers adapted anyway. They learned small tricks. How to tie straps differently, how to pad pressure points with scraps of cloth, how to rearrange items in a pack so the weight felt slightly less cruel. These adjustments were not taught officially. They were passed along quietly, from one tired soldier to another. Improvisation became a survival skill early. Some men carried extra items that brought comfort rather than utility. A photograph, a small book, a lucky charm. These added weight too, but they felt lighter somehow. The army did not account for morale in its calculations. As units prepared to move, inspections became frequent. Gear had to be present and properly packed. Missing items meant punishment. Extra items were sometimes frowned upon, sometimes ignored. It depended on the officer, the mood, and the moment. This inconsistency taught another lesson. Rules mattered, but they were flexible in practice. Learning when to follow them strictly and when to bend them became part of survival. The uniform itself changed with use. It faded, it tore, it absorbed sweat, rain, mud, and smoke. It stopped feeling new quickly. It became something lived in, not worn. And yet, it offered little comfort. There was no insulation for extreme cold beyond layers, no breathability for heat. The uniform was designed for durability, not comfort. It assumed the body would adapt. Sometimes it did, sometimes it did not. As soldiers wore their equipment longer, they began to understand a difficult truth. Everything carried had a cost. Energy spent lifting weight could not be spent reacting. Fatigue built quietly. It did not announce itself until it mattered. This was especially clear during long movements. Marches that stretched for miles, roads that seemed endless, dust that coated everything, sweat that soaked through fabric and dried stiff. Conversation faded during these marches. Breathing became louder. Thoughts narrowed. The world shrank to the space just ahead. In these moments, humor sometimes appeared unexpectedly. Someone would comment on the absurdity of carrying a shovel everywhere. Someone else would joke that the pack was getting heavier on its own. These small remarks broke the tension briefly. Then the march continued. The equipment also shaped how soldiers slept, ate, and rested. Packs became pillows, helmets became seats, rifles were never far away. There was no true separation between the soldier and his gear. This constant closeness created familiarity. It also created dependency. Losing equipment was frightening. It meant vulnerability. It meant exposure. Survival was now tied to objects. This was a shift from civilian life, where survival depended on systems and communities. Here, it depended on what you could carry and protect. As deployment approached, soldiers learned to live inside this weight. It became normal, in a way. The body adjusted, muscles adapted, pain became background noise. But the weight never truly disappeared. It waited. It waited for moments when speed mattered, when exhaustion stacked on exhaustion, when fear tightened the body and made every pound feel heavier. The uniform and equipment were meant to prepare soldiers for war. They did. They also taught an early lesson that would repeat again and again. Survival would rarely be comfortable. It would be inconvenient, heavy, restrictive, and there would always be more to carry than you wanted. In the next chapter, this weight will follow soldiers onto ships. It will sit beside them in cramped quarters. It will move with them across a dark ocean, where the danger is invisible and the waiting begins again. The battlefield is still far away, but survival is already being tested. The ocean came before the battlefield. For many American soldiers, this was the first time they had ever seen it, not as a postcard image or a distant horizon, but as something vast and unavoidable. It stretched in every direction, calm one moment and unsettling the next. It did not look dangerous. That was part of the problem. Troop ships were crowded, very crowded. Men were packed into tight sleeping areas with bunks stacked high, sometimes 4 or 5 levels deep. There was barely enough room to sit up, and definitely not enough room to think clearly. Personal space disappeared completely. The air smelled like oil, metal, sweat, and too many people breathing at once. Claustrophobia arrived quickly. Some men felt it the first night, others a few days in. Once it settled, it was hard to shake. There was nowhere to walk alone, nowhere to be quiet. Even sleep was shared. Someone was always coughing, shifting, or climbing in or out of a bunk. Seasickness made things worse. The ocean had its own rhythm, and it did not care whether your body agreed with it. Even strong, healthy men found themselves leaning over railings, dizzy and pale. Meals were skipped. Faces lost color. The ship kept moving anyway. There was a strange comfort in knowing everyone was miserable together. Days aboard ship blurred into each other. Time was measured by meals, drills, and announcements over loudspeakers that were often hard to understand. Some men read, some wrote letters they were not sure they could send. Others simply lay still, conserving energy. At night, blackout conditions were enforced. No lights, no cigarettes on deck, curtains drawn tight. The ship moved through darkness, silent and cautious. This was when the danger felt closest. German U-boats hunted these waters. Everyone knew it. No one talked about it much. Talking made it real, and reality was already heavy enough. The ocean looked peaceful, but that peace was deceptive. Somewhere below the surface, unseen, were submarines waiting. Drills were conducted regularly. Lifeboat procedures, emergency signals, where to go if the ship was hit. These drills were orderly on paper. In reality, they raised more questions than answers. Could everyone really make it out in time? Would there be enough lifeboats? How long could someone survive in the water? These were not questions with comforting answers. Soldiers learned quickly that survival at sea depended on chance as much as preparation. A torpedo strike could come without warning. One moment the ship would be steady, the next chaos. Most crossings passed without incident, but the possibility hovered constantly. Every creak of the hull sounded important. Every sudden noise made heads turn. The ocean at night felt especially watchful. Some men slept through it all, exhaustion winning over anxiety. Others lay awake, listening to the ship move, imagining what they could not see. Fear did not always feel dramatic. Often it was quiet and persistent, like background noise that never fully stopped. Boredom was another enemy. There was nothing to do for long stretches. No destinations to count down to. No landmarks. Just water. Endless water. Days passed slowly, then quickly, then slowly again. The mind drifted. Thoughts circled. This was dangerous in its own way. With nothing to distract them, men thought about home, about unfinished conversations, about what might happen next. Some imagined combat in vivid detail. Others avoided thinking about it entirely. Humor helped when it appeared. Someone would joke about the food. Someone else would complain about the bunks. These small moments of laughter felt valuable, almost necessary. They reminded everyone that they were still human, not just cargo. Meals were basic and repetitive. Bread, stew, coffee. That was more comforting than good. Eating was often rushed, especially when seas were rough. Trays slid, people stumbled. Spills were common. No one complained much. Complaining felt pointless. The ship itself became familiar over time. Men learned its sounds, its vibrations, the way it responded to waves. This familiarity offered a strange sense of safety. As long as the ship felt the same, nothing had changed. But the ocean did not always cooperate. Storms rolled in without concern for schedules. Waves grew taller. The ship pitched and rolled. Loose items crashed. Sleep became nearly impossible. During these moments, the ocean felt alive, powerful, and indifferent. It was a reminder that even without enemy action, survival was not guaranteed. Communication with the outside world was minimal. Letters written on board were often held until arrival. News was scarce and outdated. Rumors filled the gaps. Someone had heard about heavy fighting. Someone else claimed the war might be over soon. No one knew what to believe. This uncertainty became normal. Men adapted by lowering expectations. They stopped trying to predict the future. Focus narrowed to the present moment. Get through the day, get through the night. That was enough. The crossing was also a kind of pause. Training was behind them. Combat was ahead. This space in between felt unreal, like time suspended. Some men felt detached, as if watching themselves from a distance. Others felt oddly calm, as though the worst part was already over. Both reactions were temporary. As land finally approached, the mood shifted. There was relief, but also tension. The ocean had been dangerous, but it had also been passive. Land meant action, orders, movement. The ship slowed. Ports came into view. Cranes, docks, strange buildings, strange accents drifting across the water. The world suddenly felt very large again. Soldiers gathered their gear. Packs were lifted. Rifles checked. Helmets adjusted. The weight returned to full awareness. The journey was ending, but the war was not. For some, stepping onto foreign soil was exciting. For others, it was sobering. The distance from home felt real now, irreversible. Looking back, many veterans later said that the ocean crossing was one of the most unsettling parts of the war. Not because of what happened, but because of what might have happened. The waiting, the invisibility of the threat, the feeling of being carried towards something unknown. Survival during the crossing depended on patience, luck, and endurance. You could do everything right and still be vulnerable. That lesson would repeat itself many times. As the ship docked and orders were given, the ocean faded behind them. It would not be forgotten, but it would be replaced by new dangers, new routines, and new uncertainties. The soldiers had arrived. They were no longer in transit. In the next chapter, the war will stop feeling abstract. The sounds will change, the language will change, and the distance between the soldier and the world he left behind will grow wider than any ocean. The first thing many soldiers noticed was the smell. It was different from home. Sometimes it was damp stone and coal smoke. Sometimes it was salt, rot, and vegetation. Sometimes it was all of it mixed together. Whatever it was, it did not smell familiar, and that made everything else feel unfamiliar too. Stepping off the ship did not feel like stepping into a battlefield. It felt like stepping into confusion. Ports were busy, loud, and crowded. Orders were shouted. Lines formed and dissolved. Trucks arrived and left. There was movement everywhere, but no clear sense of direction. Soldiers followed instructions without really knowing where they were going. Foreign soil felt solid and unreal at the same time. In places like Britain, the landscape looked peaceful at first. Green fields, stone buildings, narrow roads. It almost felt like a postcard, but there were signs of strain. Blackout curtains in windows, buildings with damage patched over, civilians who moved quickly and spoke quietly when the subject of the war came up. In North Africa, the heat arrived immediately. It pressed down without warning. The sun felt closer. The air felt dry and heavy. Dust clung to skin and clothing. Water became something to think about constantly. In the Pacific, the jungle felt alive, not in a friendly way. Insects were everywhere. The air was thick and damp. Nothing dried properly. Equipment rusted. Clothes stayed wet. The body never fully cooled down. Wherever soldiers landed, comfort was limited. Living conditions in camps were basic. Tents, temporary buildings, shared spaces. Privacy did not exist. Sleep was uneven. Food was functional. Clean water was sometimes scarce. This was when the distance from home became sharp. The language barrier added to it. Accents were hard to understand. In some places, English was spoken differently. In others, it was not spoken at all. Simple tasks like asking for directions or buying food became awkward exercises in guessing. Some soldiers enjoyed these differences. It made the world feel larger. Others felt uneasy. Being unable to communicate easily made them feel exposed. First encounters with local civilians were usually brief and cautious. In Europe, civilians often looked tired. War had been part of their lives for years already. There was curiosity about American soldiers, but also reserve. Smiles were polite. Conversations were short. In some areas, children followed soldiers, fascinated by uniforms and equipment. Candy and gum became tools of diplomacy. These small exchanges felt strangely important. They reminded soldiers that the war affected more than just armies. Cultural differences showed up in unexpected ways. Food tasted different. Social rules felt unfamiliar. Simple gestures could mean different things. Soldiers learned quickly to watch and copy rather than assume. There was also a growing sense of being observed. Uniforms made soldiers visible. They stood out everywhere they went. This brought attention, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. It was a reminder that they were guests in someone else's home, even as they prepared for combat on that soil. Rumors filled the gaps in information. Some said the fighting would start soon. Others claimed it might be months away. Stories circulated about enemy strength, terrain, and tactics. Few of these stories were accurate. All of them were repeated. Waiting returned. Days were spent training again, but differently this time. Marches through unfamiliar terrain. Drills adapted to local conditions. Equipment was adjusted. New instructions were added. Some older ones were quietly ignored. This training felt more serious. The presence of experienced officers and allied soldiers changed the atmosphere. These were people who had already seen combat. They moved differently. They spoke less. When they gave advice, it was practical and blunt. Soldiers listened. At night, camps were quieter. The novelty of being overseas wore off quickly. Fatigue set in. The body was constantly adjusting to new conditions. Sleep came unevenly. Thoughts of home surfaced more often now. The reality of distance became unavoidable. There were no quick returns, no weekend visits. Letters took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Some men began to count time differently. Not by days, but by meals, by letters, by changes in weather. Long-term thinking felt risky. Focusing on the present felt safer. Survival, in these first days overseas, was mostly about adaptation, learning what not to touch, learning how to stay dry, or cool, or warm depending on where you were, learning which local food was safe to eat, learning when to rest and when to push through exhaustion. Mistakes happened. Someone drank untreated water and got sick. Someone ignored advice about insects and paid for it later. These were not dramatic failures, but they had consequences. Illness could remove a soldier from duty as effectively as injury. The environment was no longer neutral. It pushed back. Equipment that had seemed fine in training revealed weaknesses. Boots fell apart faster. Weapons required more maintenance. Clothing failed in unexpected ways. Supplies were sometimes delayed or missing. Improvisation became necessary again. Soldiers traded items, borrowed tools, modified gear. Nothing stayed exactly as issued. Survival depended on flexibility, not perfection. Emotionally, there was a sense of suspension. Combat had not started yet, but it felt closer. The world around them was already shaped by war. The calm of home felt very far away now. Some soldiers felt excited, others felt dread. Many felt both at the same time. These feelings shifted daily, sometimes hourly. No one knew when the first shot would be fired. That uncertainty was heavy. It followed soldiers through camp, through training, through restless nights. It made small noises sound important. It made every order feel loaded with possibility. The war was no longer something on the radio. It was in the ground under their boots, in the air they breathed, in the tired faces around them. The first days overseas taught soldiers an important lesson. They were no longer preparing for war. They were inside it. And yet, much of the time, nothing happened, which is exactly what made the waiting so difficult. In the next chapter, that waiting will stretch longer than anyone expects. and it will test survival in ways no training manual ever described. War, as most soldiers discovered quickly, was not constant action. It was waiting. Waiting took many forms. Waiting for orders, waiting for transport, waiting for weather to change, waiting for something to happen, or for nothing to happen at all. Days passed where the most important task was simply staying where you were told to stay. This kind of waiting was different from anything most men had experienced before. In civilian life, waiting usually led somewhere. A shift ended, a train arrived, a letter came. In war, waiting often had no clear end. It stretched out, thin and uncomfortable. Camps settled into routines that felt temporary but lasted far longer than expected. Reveille, roll call, meals, maintenance, more maintenance. Equipment was cleaned and cleaned again. Rifles were taken apart and reassembled until it could be done without thinking. Weather became a constant companion. In Europe, rain turned ground into mud. Mud clung to boots, uniforms, equipment. It worked its way into everything. Foxholes filled with water, trenches collapsed. Nothing stayed dry for long. In colder regions, the damp turned dangerous. Feet stayed wet, socks stayed wet, skin softened and cracked. Trenchfoot was a quiet threat. It did not arrive suddenly. It crept in over days of neglect and exposure. In warmer areas, heat drained energy. The sun wore people down without making much noise. Insects bit constantly. Flies gathered around anything resembling food. Sweat never fully dried. These conditions did not pause just because nothing else was happening. Waiting eroded morale slowly. At first, men joked about it. "Hurry up and wait" became a common phrase. It sounded funny because it was true. Orders came suddenly, then dissolved into long stretches of inactivity. Over time, humor thinned. Rumors filled the silence. Someone heard the attack would start tomorrow. Someone else said it was delayed. Someone claimed the enemy was retreating. Someone claimed the opposite. None of it could be verified. Uncertainty became exhausting. The mind searched for meaning in small things. A change in routine. A new officer arriving. Extra ammunition being issued. These details felt important, even when they were not. Waiting also gave fear space to grow. In moments of activity, fear had somewhere to go. In waiting, it lingered. It replayed imagined scenarios. It asked questions without answers. What if the enemy attacked now? What if support did not arrive? What if something went wrong? These thoughts were rarely spoken aloud. Men learned quickly that showing too much anxiety was risky. It could spread, it could draw attention. So fear stayed private, managed quietly. Some soldiers filled time by writing letters. Not all letters were sent. Some were written and rewritten, then folded away. Writing felt like control. Even if the words never reached home, putting them on paper helped organize thoughts. Others read whatever they could find. Old newspapers, tattered books, instruction manuals, read cover to cover. Anything to occupy the mind. Sleep was uneven. Nights were interrupted by guard duty, alerts, or noise. Sleeping during the day was often difficult. The body never fully rested. Fatigue became a constant background condition. This was dangerous. Exhaustion dulls judgment. It slows reactions. It makes small mistakes more likely. Waiting without rest drained men in ways that training never had. Discipline began to feel heavier during long waits. Orders that made sense in action felt pointless in stillness. Cleaning an already clean rifle. Polishing equipment that would be dirty again in hours. These tasks filled time, but they also frustrated. Yet, they served a purpose. They gave structure to waiting. Without structure, time could stretch in uncomfortable ways. Minds wandered. Anxiety grew. Routine acted as a kind of anchor, even when it felt meaningless. The environment continued to press in. Mud, insects, cold, heat, dampness. These were not dramatic enemies. They were constant ones. They wore people down slowly, without announcing themselves. Men adapted as best they could. They learned how to keep feet dry when possible, how to sleep in short bursts, how to recognize the signs of trouble in themselves and others. This adaptation was uneven. Some handled waiting well. They accepted it, found ways to pass time. Others struggled. Restlessness turned into irritation. Small annoyances felt large. Tempers shortened. Commanders watched closely. Morale mattered, even if it was not always understood. Units that waited too long without action risked losing sharpness. Training drills were sometimes increased just to keep men engaged. Still, nothing fully solved the problem. Waiting was part of war. It was not heroic. It was not interesting. It did not make good stories later, but it shaped survival as much as any battle. Many soldiers later said that waiting was harder than fighting. Fighting was intense but finite. Waiting felt endless. During these long pauses, some men began to question why they were there, not in a political sense, but a personal one. What would happen to them? What would remain of their lives afterward? These questions had no answers. The best strategy became narrowing focus. Get through today. Get through this shift. Get through this night. Thinking beyond that felt unnecessary, sometimes dangerous. Then, often without warning, waiting ended. Not gradually, not politely. It stopped abruptly. Orders came. Movement began. The routine shattered. Gear was packed quickly. Positions changed. The atmosphere shifted. Suddenly, everything felt urgent. The transition from waiting to action was jarring. Bodies and minds that had settled into stillness were asked to move fast, to decide quickly, to react under pressure. This sudden shift was one of the most dangerous moments, because waiting dulls alertness, even as it increases anxiety. When the first signs of combat appeared, many soldiers were not fully ready. No one ever is. But waiting made the adjustment harder. In the next chapter, that adjustment will happen instantly. There will be no preparation, no countdown. Combat will begin without warning, and survival will depend on how well a soldier can move from stillness into chaos in a single moment. Combat rarely announced itself. There was no clear moment when someone said, "This is it." No clean transition from waiting to fighting. Most of the time, it started in confusion, half understood, already moving too fast. One moment, soldiers were walking, talking quietly, adjusting gear. The next, there was noise, a sharp crack, a distant explosion, someone shouting something unclear. It took a few seconds for the mind to catch up. Those seconds mattered. The first shots were often disorienting. Gunfire sounded different than expected. Louder, closer, hard to place. Echoes bounced off terrain. A shot from far away could sound near. A nearby explosion could feel distant. Training did not fully prepare soldiers for this. On the range, shots were spaced and controlled. In combat, they overlapped. They blended into a constant, uneven noise that made thinking difficult. Commands were harder to hear. Words were lost. Meaning had to be guessed. Vision narrowed. Under stress, the world shrank. Soldiers focused on what was directly in front of them. Peripheral details faded. Time felt strange. Moments stretched. Movements felt slow, even when they were fast. Some men froze. Not because they were cowards, but because the brain needed time to adjust. Combat demanded decisions faster than thought. Move or stay still. Fire or wait. Follow orders or react instinctively. Instinct often won. This was not always bad. Instinct kept people alive. It dropped them to the ground when shots came close. It pushed them toward cover without conscious thought. But instinct could also mislead. Running when staying still was safer. Standing up when staying down mattered more. Combat did not follow simple rules, and learning that took time. Time that was not always available. Communication broke down quickly. Radios failed. Runners got lost or injured. Shouted orders were misunderstood. Units became fragmented. Soldiers fought alongside people they barely knew, sometimes losing track of their own squad. This fragmentation was dangerous. Survival depended on awareness, but awareness was limited. Smoke, dust, vegetation, buildings, all blocked sight lines. The enemy was often unseen. Shots came from directions no one expected. Fear arrived fully now. It was physical, heart racing, hands shaking, mouth dry, thoughts racing too fast to settle on anything useful. Some soldiers felt detached, as if watching themselves act. Others felt everything intensely. There was no single reaction that guaranteed survival. Some men became extremely focused, calm in appearance, efficient in action. Others struggled to control their movements. Both could survive. Both could be lost. The environment shaped everything. In open fields, there was little cover. Movement felt exposed. In towns, buildings created hiding places and traps at the same time. In forests or jungles, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Threats were close and unseen. Combat was loud, but also strangely quiet in moments. There were pauses, lulls where firing stopped briefly. In these gaps, sounds returned. Breathing, shuffling feet, someone whispering. These moments were tense. Everyone waited for the noise to return. It always did. Survival during these first encounters often came down to small decisions: which direction to crawl, which wall to press against, whether to reload now or wait. These decisions were made with incomplete information. Luck played a role: a bullet landing inches away instead of inches closer, a piece of cover holding, a weapon functioning when needed. These factors were beyond control. Training emphasized courage, but combat rewarded caution. Those who moved carefully, who used cover, who listened more than they rushed, often lasted longer. Recklessness looked brave but was rarely sustainable. Time perception changed. Minutes felt like hours. Hours passed unnoticed. Afterward, memories were fragmented. Some moments were vivid, others disappeared entirely. Combat did not store neatly in the mind. Noise caused exhaustion. The constant sound of gunfire, explosions, and shouting wore people down quickly. Even when not actively engaged, the stress remained. Muscles stayed tense. The body burned energy constantly. Fatigue set in fast, and with fatigue came mistakes. A misstep, a misfire, a delayed reaction. In combat, these small errors had consequences. There was little room for recovery. Seeing wounded comrades changed everything. The abstract idea of injury became real. Blood, pain, confusion, medics moving quickly, shouts for help. These sights stayed with soldiers. They made the danger undeniable. Some soldiers helped without thinking. Others hesitated, unsure what to do. Both reactions were human. Fear of being hit while helping was real. Survival sometimes meant choosing between safety and responsibility. These choices left marks that lasted long after the battle ended. As combat continued, routines slowly formed. Soldiers learned how the enemy moved, what sounds meant danger, what patterns repeated. This learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Mistakes were corrected quickly, or not at all. Night made everything harder. Visibility dropped. Shadows moved. Sounds carried strangely. Identifying friend from foe became difficult. Accidental fire increased. Tension stayed high. Sleep became nearly impossible during active fighting. Short rests happened when they could, often in uncomfortable positions. The body stayed alert even when exhausted. When combat finally paused, relief came mixed with shock. Some soldiers laughed suddenly. Others went quiet. Hands shook. Stomachs turned. The body processed stress in unpredictable ways. There was often little time to reflect. Orders came quickly. Positions changed. The unit moved or prepared for another engagement. There was no space to fully understand what had just happened. This was a dangerous period. After adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit hard. Reaction times slowed. Awareness dropped. The body wanted rest, but the situation did not allow it. Many casualties occurred after initial fighting, not during it. Combat did not follow a clear beginning and end. It flowed unevenly. Bursts of intensity followed by uneasy calm. Each transition tested survival in different ways. The first experience of combat changed soldiers permanently. It stripped away assumptions. It revealed limits. It taught lessons no manual could convey. It showed how fragile plans were and how quickly control disappeared. Most importantly, it redefined survival. Survival was no longer about preparation or endurance alone. It was about adapting under pressure, about managing fear without eliminating it, about functioning in chaos. Some soldiers found they could do this. Others struggled. Both outcomes were common. There was no shame in either, though shame was often felt anyway. Combat did not care about intentions. It responded only to actions and chance. When the fighting eased and the immediate danger passed, soldiers often realized how little they remembered clearly. The noise, the movement, the fear, it all blended. What remained was a deep awareness. The war was real now, not as an idea, not as a rumor, but as something lived through. And this was only the beginning. In the next chapter, soldiers would learn that even when the enemy was not firing, danger remained. The land itself would become a threat. Weather, terrain, and disease would test survival quietly, patiently, and without mercy. When the guns fell silent, danger did not disappear. For many American soldiers in World War II, the most relentless threats were not always German or Japanese troops. They were the land, the weather, and the slow, grinding effects of exposure. Terrain dictated survival. In Europe, muddy fields swallowed boots and vehicles alike. Rain turned roads into traps. Foxholes filled with water overnight. Soldiers slept in damp uniforms, boots never fully drying. Feet softened, cracked, and blistered. Trench foot was common, painful, debilitating, and sometimes permanent. In Italy, steep hills and mountains exhausted men before they ever reached the enemy. Every movement uphill burned energy. Every descent strained joints already overloaded by gear. Supply lines stretched thin. Ammunition, food, and medical support lagged behind. In the Pacific, the environment was unforgiving in different ways. Jungles closed in tightly. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Heat and humidity drained strength constantly. Sweat never stopped. Clothing stayed wet. Skin broke down. Infections followed. The land concealed threats. Snipers hid in trees. Enemy positions blended into foliage. Paths were booby-trapped. A single step off a trail could trigger an explosion. Survival required constant attention, even when no fighting was happening. Weather was not neutral. Cold killed quietly. In winter campaigns, frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Metal froze to bare skin. Weapons malfunctioned. Soldiers shivered through nights with inadequate shelter. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. Heat killed differently. In North Africa and the Pacific, dehydration was constant. Water supplies were limited and often contaminated. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke took men out of combat without a single shot fired. Salt loss caused cramps and confusion. Rain was its own enemy. It soaked equipment, ruined food, made movement slow and loud. It increased illness. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and other diseases spread rapidly in wet environments. Mosquitoes were relentless. Medical science helped, but limits remained. Quinine and later antimalarial drugs reduced deaths, but compliance was inconsistent. Pills caused side effects. Some soldiers skipped doses. Others had no choice due to shortages. Disease did not care about bravery. Rats and insects were everywhere. They crawled over sleeping men. They chewed gear. They contaminated food. Lice spread typhus. Flies swarmed wounds. There was no escape. Constant irritation wore down morale. Food itself became a challenge. Rations were designed for calories, not comfort. They were repetitive. Canned meat, crackers, powdered drinks, hot meals were rare near the front. Cold food lowered morale and body temperature. Hunger was not always starvation, but it was persistent. Soldiers burned thousands of calories a day. Rations rarely matched the demand. Weight loss was common. Weakness crept in quietly. Water discipline mattered. Drinking too fast led to sickness. Drinking too little led to collapse. In combat zones, water sources were risky. Contamination caused outbreaks of illness that spread faster than bullets. Sleep deprivation was constant. Even when fighting paused, the environment prevented real rest. Cold ground, insects, noise, fear of attack. Guards rotated through the night. No one slept deeply. The body adapted poorly. After days or weeks of poor sleep, judgment declined. Reaction times slowed. Emotions became unstable. Small problems felt overwhelming. Arguments broke out. Mistakes increased. Mental strain grew alongside physical exhaustion. Isolation weighed heavily. Soldiers were far from home, often without reliable communication. Letters took weeks or months. News from home was incomplete or delayed. Rumors filled the gaps. Silence was unsettling. In quiet stretches, thoughts wandered. Fear resurfaced. Images from combat replayed. The mind struggled to rest even when the body was still. Some soldiers coped by routine, cleaning weapons, checking gear repeatedly, writing letters. These actions created a sense of control in an environment that offered very little. Others withdrew. They spoke less, moved slower, followed orders mechanically. This emotional numbness was a form of survival, but it came at a cost. The environment punished mistakes immediately. Failing to dig in properly meant exposure to weather and enemy fire. Neglecting hygiene led to infection. Ignoring foot care could end a soldier's ability to march. Leadership mattered here. Officers and non-commissioned officers who enforced rest, hygiene, and discipline improved survival rates. Those who ignored these details saw units degrade quickly. Survival was cumulative. Each day of exposure reduced resilience. Each illness made recovery harder. Each night without sleep increased risk. The enemy did not need to attack to weaken a unit. In the Pacific, disease caused more casualties than combat in some campaigns. Men were evacuated not for wounds, but for fever, dehydration, and infections that could no longer be managed in the field. In Europe, winter weather shaped entire offensives. Operations slowed, vehicles stalled, weapons froze. Soldiers fought the cold as much as the enemy. Frostbite cases filled aid stations. Psychologically, this invisible enemy was draining. You could not shoot rain. You could not charge cold. You could not outmaneuver mosquitoes. Endurance became the primary weapon. Small comforts became valuable. A dry pair of socks, a hot drink, a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. These moments restored morale more effectively than speeches. Survival depended on adaptability. Those who learned to respect the environment to adjusted clothing, pace, and expectations lasted longer. Those who fought it directly often paid the price. The land did not care about strategy. It did not care about objectives or millions. It imposed its own rules, and soldiers had to obey or suffer. As weeks turned into months, many realized that surviving World War II was not just about surviving battles. It was about surviving everything in between. And while the environment was relentless, it was still predictable compared to the next threat. Because soon, soldiers would face an enemy that attacked from within. Not bullets, not weather, but the slow erosion of the mind itself. In the next chapter, survival would become psychological. And for many, this was the hardest fight of all. In war, food was never just food. It was survival, morale, and sometimes a reminder of home or the lack of it. Soldiers quickly learned that meals were not a luxury. They were functional, repetitive, and often disappointing. Hunger became a constant companion, whispering reminders that the body was under siege, even when bullets were not. Rations were standardized, but reality rarely matched the plan. The most common were rations for infantry on the move. Small cans of meat, biscuits, a few chocolate bars, powdered coffee, and chewing gum. Each day provided enough calories, theoretically, but the monotony was crushing. After a week, even chocolate tasted bland. After a month, biscuits seemed almost offensive. So rations were slightly better, often intended for slightly less mobile units. They included canned meats, beans, fruit, and sometimes cookies. They were heavy to carry, difficult to heat, and often smelly. Soldiers joked that if rations were meant to taste good, someone had forgotten to tell the army. In combat zones, supply lines were unreliable. A unit might receive a full shipment one week, then barely enough the next. Soldiers adapted. They scavenged from local populations. They traded with allies. They learned to make small modifications, soaking biscuits to soften them, mixing canned items to hide flavor, even improvising utensils when none were available. Hunger affected decision-making more than most realized. A tired, underfed body became sluggish. Reactions slowed. Energy dropped. Soldiers sometimes pushed forward despite discomfort, only to realize they lacked strength when it mattered most. Energy rationing became instinctual. Eat now or save for later. Skip a meal to keep moving. These decisions were constant. Water was equally critical. Drinking too little caused dehydration. Drinking too much, or from unclean sources, caused illness. Soldiers learned quickly to identify safe water, to boil it when possible, and to ration it in harsh conditions. Misjudgment could be fatal, even far from enemy fire, yet food offered more than calories. A hot meal could lift spirits in ways bullets never could. Soldiers remembered the rare occasions when cooks made soup or bread that actually tasted good. Even a small treat gum chocolate, a fruit can could boost morale. Tiny comforts became survival tools, reminders that life still existed outside combat. Improvisation extended to hunting and foraging in extreme cases. Some units in the Pacific learned to catch fish or small animals. In Europe, soldiers sometimes supplemented rations with local produce or scavenged abandoned buildings. These actions were not romantic, they were practical. Sometimes they saved lives, sometimes they caused illness. The monotony of eating the same thing every day affected morale silently. Men joked, complained, or wrote about food in letters home. Humor became a shield, but the fatigue of repetition wore everyone down. By the end of long campaigns, soldiers often celebrated small variations in taste, as if they were luxuries. Shared meals built camaraderie. Even when portions were meager, eating together allowed soldiers to connect. Stories were exchanged, observations made, laughter briefly cut through fear. Bonds formed over the act of sustaining life, small as it was, yet rations were never guaranteed. A sudden advance could leave soldiers without meals for a day or more. Delays in supply convoys created improvisation under stress. Soldiers carried extra food whenever possible, hoarding what little they could, understanding that scarcity was as dangerous as bullets. Food shortages highlighted another truth. Survival was never purely individual. A soldier who refused to share with a comrade risked morale breakdown in the group. Groups that protected each other, sharing small extras, often survived better as a unit. Cooperation was as important as courage. Even in the best circumstances, the psychological effect of hunger lingered. A full stomach might bring comfort, but it did not erase fear, cold, or fatigue. Hunger sharpened awareness of the environment. It forced prioritization of effort. It reminded soldiers constantly that survival depended not just on skill, but on managing basic needs. Small innovations emerged. Soldiers learned to mix rations with water for porridge, to crush biscuits for makeshift bread, to carry small items in pockets for emergencies. These improvisations were often personal, passed quietly from one soldier to another. The army never documented them, but they saved lives. In some cases, soldiers risked more than hunger to find extra food. Scavenging near enemy lines or abandoned positions offered calories but also danger. A short walk could become deadly. A risk that seemed minor when the stomach growled could become fatal if miscalculated. Meals also reinforced structure. Even when food was meager, eating at scheduled times helped maintain discipline. It punctuated the endless rhythm of waiting and moving. Without this structure, time and energy slipped away unnoticed. In the end, survival in war was never only about fighting. It was about managing the body quietly, constantly, in ways soldiers might take for granted in civilian life. Eating enough, drinking enough, preserving strength. Every ration, every sip of water, every tiny snack was a small victory, a thread holding life together. By the time soldiers reached the front lines, these small victories became crucial. Hungry, exhausted, and already tested by transit, training, and environmental hardship, their ability to endure food scarcity often decided whether they survived to face bullets. And just when they thought they might rest after a meal, another enemy waited. Exhaustion, sleep deprivation, the creeping erosion of alertness. Food was only the first battlefield inside the soldier's own body, a test that would continue relentlessly in the days to come. In the next chapter, sleep, or the lack of it, would become the enemy you could not avoid. Sleep was supposed to restore the body. It did not. Not really. For soldiers in World War II, rest was sporadic, stolen in fragments, and often impossible in the conditions they faced. Fatigue became a constant companion, a quiet but persistent enemy that drained strength, dulled reactions, and made small mistakes deadly. Even before combat, sleep was elusive. During training, soldiers were woken before dawn, forced into long marches, and kept alert for drills, inspections, or sudden exercises. Beds were shared or non-existent. Thin mattresses or hard floors replaced comfort. Nights were punctuated by noise, footsteps, snoring, and coughing. Few slept well. When deployed overseas, conditions worsened. Tents leaked. Foxholes filled with rainwater. Wooden bunks creaked. Equipment was always nearby, ready to be packed in moments. Even when there was quiet, the mind did not rest. Fear, anticipation, and the unfamiliar environment kept soldiers alert. Combat destroyed whatever rest remained. Gunfire, explosions, and shouting tore through the night. Artillery created tremors that felt as if the ground itself was moving. Enemy planes flew overhead. Snipers were invisible but present. Sleep became impossible without extreme exhaustion, and even then, it was only light and fitful. Sleeping in foxholes was uncomfortable, sometimes dangerous. Men curled up with rifles beside them, packs as pillows, helmets still on their heads. Mud, insects, and cold seeped in. Rain made blankets useless. Even the most adaptable soldier struggled to find rest. Microsleeps became common. Soldiers nodded off for seconds or minutes during marches, guard duty, or patrols. These brief lapses were dangerous, but the body demanded them. Fatigue could not be ignored. Exhaustion was cumulative. A single sleepless night was manageable. 2 or 3 began to impair judgment. After a week of interrupted rest, decisions slowed. Coordination suffered. Emotions became unstable. The smallest stressor could trigger panic or irrational behavior. Chronic fatigue altered perception. Time slowed or raced unpredictably. Sounds were exaggerated. Shadows became threats. Even when nothing was happening, the body felt under constant strain. Combat, waiting, and environmental stress compounded. The brain and body could not keep up. Accidents increased. Slips on mud, falls from transport vehicles, mishandling of equipment. Many casualties were non-combat related, but directly linked to exhaustion. Soldiers became vulnerable in ways no manual warned about. Sleeping upright, in shifts, became a skill. Some learned to rest while sitting against trees or leaning on walls. Others perfected the art of dozing with minimal movement, maintaining awareness for sudden threats. Every second of rest counted, and each was precious. Exhaustion changed how soldiers fought. Reaction times slowed, instincts dulled, mistakes multiplied. Fear became sharper, not weaker. Every engagement, every decision, was colored by fatigue. Sometimes the difference between life and death was simply having enough energy to duck or run. Sleep deprivation also attacked morale. Irritation came easily. Humor faded. Patience evaporated. Soldiers found themselves snapping at comrades over trivial matters. Bonds frayed under the weight of constant exhaustion. Yet shared miseries sometimes strengthened connections, creating camaraderie born of endurance. The mind struggled to distinguish real danger from imagined. Every noise in the dark became a potential threat. Footsteps, wind, or distant artillery were interpreted as imminent danger. Anxiety persisted even in the absence of actual combat. This hyper-awareness was both protective and exhausting. Medical officers warned of the consequences. Delirium, hallucinations, and psychosis occurred when sleep deprivation became severe. Men who could not rest for days were a danger to themselves and others. In some cases, commanders had to remove soldiers from duty before their bodies gave out entirely. Adaptation became a survival skill. Soldiers learned to rest in shifts, to accept brief naps wherever possible, to ration energy across the day, to listen to the body without fully surrendering to it. These small strategies often made the difference between surviving another week or failing. Even food and water could not compensate. A well-fed soldier who had no rest still broke down quickly. The mind could not function. Decision-making suffered. Physical strength diminished. Survival was always tied to the interplay of multiple factors: nutrition, rest, environment, and mental state. Some soldiers coped with humor or superstition, talking quietly, telling jokes, reciting letters, or keeping small routines helped maintain a sense of control. These psychological tools were invisible but powerful. They sustained morale during nights that felt endless. In essence, combat was not the only threat. Sleep deprivation and exhaustion were constant, invisible enemies. They crept into every action, every decision, and every moment of waiting. They made the familiar unfamiliar. They turned routine tasks into potential hazards. By the time soldiers faced battle after days of interrupted rest, they were already tested. The body was tired. The mind was weary. And yet, the war demanded action. Survival was no longer just a matter of courage or skill. It was a careful, ongoing negotiation with one's own body and mind. In the next chapter, we will see how even a minor wound could become a life-threatening challenge, and how survival often depended on luck as much as preparation. In war, luck could be as important as skill. Even the best-trained soldier, with the strongest body and sharpest instincts, was vulnerable. A stray bullet, shrapnel from an unseen explosion, or even a misstep in the mud could change everything. Survival often hinged on factors beyond control. The first shock came with injury. Pain arrived suddenly, sharply, and often unpredictably. Blood could feel hotter than expected, movement slower, the world narrowing down to a single immediate problem: stay alive long enough to get help. Panic was common. Fear of permanent injury or death pressed in quickly. Field medicine was limited. Medics were brave, often overworked, and minimally equipped. They moved through chaos with skill and speed, but supplies were finite. Bandages, morphine, antiseptics, and stretchers were shared among dozens of wounded. Not every injury could be treated immediately. The first moments after being hit were critical. Soldiers learned to recognize whether they could continue moving or needed help. Some carried each other to cover, others crawled alone. Every movement required calculation: avoid exposure, preserve strength, manage pain. Minor wounds could be deadly. A small cut could become infected, especially in wet, dirty conditions. Gangrene, tetanus, or untreated infections sometimes claimed lives faster than bullets. A soldier who seemed healthy one day could be evacuated, or worse, the next, because of a hidden complication. Evacuation was unpredictable. Ambulances, stretchers, or medics on foot did what they could, but terrain, enemy fire, and weather slowed everything. A trip that should have taken minutes could last hours. In some cases, soldiers lay in danger while waiting for extraction, unable to move without risk. Medics had to triage constantly, The wounded were classified by urgency. Some were stabilized and evacuated. Others received minimal treatment and were left until help arrived. Decisions were made quickly, and survival was partly a matter of being in the right place at the right time. Field dressings were rudimentary. Bandages soaked in antiseptics covered wounds. Splints immobilized limbs. Pain was managed with morphine or whatever was available. Soldiers learned to endure discomfort, knowing that recovery would be long and incomplete. Infection remained the silent enemy. Even after treatment, a soldier could develop fever, swelling, or pus. Medical facilities tried to manage it, but conditions at the front were never ideal. Recovery could take weeks or months, far from home. Chance played a continuous role. A soldier might survive a shot to the chest because a pack deflected it. Another might die from a seemingly minor wound due to unseen complications. Survival was often random, influenced by variables no one could predict. Weapons were not precise guides to fate. Machine gun bullets, artillery shells, shrapnel, they did not discriminate. Some missed entirely, others struck vital points. Training, courage, and awareness improved odds, but they could never guarantee safety. Comrades could make a difference. A buddy dragging you to cover, a medic arriving in time, a leader giving quick orders. These small interventions frequently saved lives, yet reliance on others carried its own risks. No one could ensure help would be there when needed. Psychological strain was immediate. Pain, fear, and helplessness combined with adrenaline, shock, and exhaustion. Soldiers sometimes acted instinctively, moving without conscious thought to survive. Others froze, paralyzed by the sudden threat. Both reactions were normal. Both could lead to survival or death. Recovery in the field was patchy. Resting in makeshift hospitals, tents, or abandoned buildings offered limited relief. Sleep was interrupted. Wounds were cleaned and redressed repeatedly. Pain lingered. Infection loomed. The mind replayed the incident, reinforcing trauma as well as caution. Evacuation to rear areas improved survival odds. Once a soldier reached a larger medical facility, chances of proper care increased dramatically. Surgeons could operate, antibiotics could be administered, and longer-term recovery was possible. But the journey was dangerous. Transport could be slow, vehicles targeted, terrain difficult. Many never made it. Survival became a combination of skill, endurance, and fortune. Soldiers learned to improvise under injury. A broken arm could be strapped. A deep wound could be covered. Simple tricks improvised splints. Pressure applied to bleeding. Movement hidden from the enemy often made the difference. Luck remained central. Being hit in one spot could be survivable. In another, fatal. Help could arrive in time or a minute too late. The environment, weather, and enemy actions all played roles outside human control. For many, this randomness was terrifying. No amount of courage could guarantee life. No skill could eliminate the possibility of sudden death from seemingly minor causes. Acceptance became a quiet companion. Do what you can, and hope the rest works out. In this environment, bravery looked different. It was less about heroic charges and more about enduring pain, moving carefully, and supporting comrades while recognizing that control was limited. Survival was humble, quiet, and uncertain. By the time soldiers recovered or didn't, they understood a harsh truth. The enemy was not always bullets, not always explosions, not even always strategy. Sometimes it was chance itself. And yet, soldiers carried on, because survival demanded it. In the next chapter, the mind itself would be tested in ways that no wound, no bullet, and no environment could fully capture. Fear, morale, and mental endurance would become as important as physical endurance, shaping who could continue and who could not. The body could survive bullets, mud, and disease. The mind sometimes could not. Combat and constant stress wore down soldiers in ways that were invisible, yet devastating. Fear was ever present, not the sudden cinematic terror of movies, but the slow, grinding anxiety that built over days, weeks, and months. It crept into decisions, sleep, and camaraderie, eroding endurance quietly. Battle fatigue had many names: shell shock, combat, stress reaction, psychoneurosis. Symptoms were subtle at first: irritability, forgetfulness, headaches, insomnia. Over time, they intensified. A soldier who had functioned competently could become paralyzed by indecision, tremble uncontrollably, or snap at comrades. Stigma made things worse. Many soldiers believed admitting fear or mental strain was shameful. Officers sometimes saw it as weakness. Those suffering silently felt isolated. They carried guilt on top of exhaustion, injury, and fear. Small coping mechanisms became vital. Jokes, quiet conversation, letter writing, small rituals all served to anchor the mind. Soldiers learned to focus on minor tasks to avoid letting fear take control. Even cleaning a rifle or organizing supplies could feel like a victory over chaos. Rumors and uncertainty worsened stress. In the absence of reliable information, imaginations filled gaps. The enemy is just over that hill, someone would say, or we're being replaced tomorrow. Few of these claims were accurate, but the mind treated them as real. The resulting anxiety was constant. Some men found relief in distraction. Card games, storytelling, or teasing each other briefly relieved tension. These moments were small oases in a desert of mental strain. Yet, the relief was fleeting. Combat, weather, and exhaustion returned immediately. Others withdrew completely. They spoke less, moved slower, avoided interaction. This emotional numbness preserved energy and awareness, but at the cost of isolation. Sometimes, it was the only way to survive mentally. Officers and medics played key roles. Leaders who recognized early signs of fatigue could rotate men, assign lighter duties, or give brief rest periods. Small interventions prevented collapse. Yet, in the chaos of battle, these opportunities were rare. Fear was not always visible. Some soldiers laughed, joked, or acted bravely while internally terrified. Others appeared calm but were on the verge of breakdown. The human mind is complex, and in war, appearances were misleading. Combat stress affected performance. Decision-making slowed. Reflexes dulled. Soldiers misread orders or failed to recognize danger. Some froze, others overreacted. Both could be fatal. Survival required a delicate balance. Fear had to be acknowledged but controlled. The mind also processed grief silently. Wounded or dead comrades left emotional scars that could erupt unexpectedly. Letters from home, small reminders of civilian life, or sudden loud noises could trigger panic or tears. Even soldiers who outwardly appeared stoic carried immense internal pressure. Some men experienced hallucinations or nightmares. The mind attempted to process the chaos it could not control. Sleep brought vivid dreams of battle, home, or both. Daytime brought flashes of memory or imagined threats. These experiences were exhausting, but part of the brain's way of coping. Coping strategies were learned or improvised, focusing on simple tasks, counting steps, repeating instructions, holding objects for comfort, quiet humor. Anything that provided a sense of control helped maintain sanity. Groups mattered. Shared experiences, empathy, and small acts of kindness, sharing food, a cigarette, a joke reinforced mental resilience. Soldiers survived in part because they watched each other, encouraged each other, and sometimes carried each other through moments of mental collapse. Yet some still broke. Men who could not adapt sometimes became useless to the unit, unable to follow orders or even move effectively. Others were evacuated for observation. In extreme cases, breakdowns led to permanent mental illness. Morale fluctuated constantly. Small victories receiving mail, good weather, a hot meal, praise from a superior lifted spirits. Small defeats, losses, injuries, delays, hunger undermined it. Survival depended on managing morale alongside physical endurance. Fear and fatigue were intertwined. The body and mind affected each other. Exhaustion amplified fear. Fear made sleep impossible. Sleepless nights worsened judgment. The cycle repeated relentlessly. Understanding this was key to survival. Soldiers learned to compartmentalize, focus on the task at hand, push aside what could not be controlled, accept that some things were random, keep moving, keep functioning, keep enduring. By the end of long campaigns, mental toughness often outweighed physical prowess. Men who could manage fear, maintain morale, and support comrades survived longer than those who were stronger, faster, or more skilled, but mentally unprepared. The invisible wounds of war, the stress, fear, and silent suffering, lasted long after bullets stopped flying. Survival, in this sense, was not heroic. It was endurance, attention, and subtle management of body and mind. It required courage, yes, but also patience, self-awareness, and sometimes sheer luck. In the next chapter, we will confront one of the heaviest burdens, the loss of comrades and the survivor's guilt that could follow, lingering even after the immediate danger had passed. In war, death was never distant. It was always close, whether visible or not. Soldiers quickly learned that losing a comrade was not a rare event, but an everyday reality. Friends, neighbors, and men they had trained alongside for months or years could be gone in a flash. Sometimes it happened during a firefight. Sometimes it was the result of disease, accident, or misfortune. Each loss left a mark, silent but heavy, shaping the ways soldiers thought, felt, and survived. The first deaths hit differently than expected. Before combat, the idea of losing someone seemed abstract. Movies, newsreels, and stories from older veterans painted war in dramatic strokes. Charges, heroism, sacrifice. Reality was less cinematic. When a buddy fell, the sound of a rifle shot or the sight of blood made abstract notions shockingly immediate. Shock often came first, then disbelief, then the grinding realization that this person would never laugh, joke, or argue with you again. Emotional responses varied, but guilt was nearly universal. Survivor's guilt became an unspoken burden. Why had I lived and he had not? Why was I farther back in the line? Why had I moved when he stayed? These questions had no answers. The mind circled endlessly, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in full-blown obsession. Guilt was quiet but persistent, infiltrating rest, meals, and even simple conversations. Death often arrived suddenly, without warning. A soldier could be talking to a friend, joking about a minor inconvenience, and then an explosion, a bullet, a falling structure changed everything. There was no time to say goodbye, no warning. One moment someone was there, the next they were gone. The randomness amplified the shock. Nothing about it was orderly or fair. Soldiers learned to numb themselves, consciously or not. At first, emotions were raw. Tears, shouting, silence, disbelief. But war forced adaptation. Men who could not continue performing tasks, following orders, or even moving efficiently jeopardized their unit. Emotional numbing became a survival mechanism. It allowed soldiers to carry on while hiding the intensity of grief behind a mask of practicality. Yet numbness came at a cost. Suppressing emotion created tension beneath the surface. Small triggers, letters from home, familiar sounds, even weather could bring it rushing back. Soldiers often felt divided, functioning outwardly while the mind replayed trauma in private moments. This quiet suffering could last long after battles ended. Rituals, no matter how small, became anchors. Soldiers found ways to honor fallen comrades. A pause in conversation, a whispered name, a mark left in a foxhole or camp. These gestures provided a fragile sense of control, a way to acknowledge loss without succumbing to it. Even small ceremonies in the middle of mud and rain could be meaningful. Death also forced harsh practical decisions. When casualties were numerous, the wounded could not always receive immediate care. Soldiers sometimes had to leave friends behind, unable to help, prioritizing survival and the needs of the many. These decisions haunted them. The logic of necessity collided with the human instinct to protect friends, leaving long-lasting emotional scars. Letters from home sometimes exacerbated guilt. A letter from a soldier's mother or sweetheart might remind him of what he had survived and what others had lost. The contrast between ordinary life and the chaos of war deepened survivors' guilt. Reading about home while buried in mud, blood, or exhaustion highlighted the gap between survival and safety. Shared grief was complicated. Men in the same unit often experienced loss together, but reactions differed. Some expressed sadness openly, others withdrew. Arguments or small irritations could escalate, fueled by cumulative stress. Units adapted, sometimes creating unspoken rules about what could be discussed and what had to remain silent. Communication itself became a balancing act. To much openness risked despair, to little created isolation. Time sometimes softened grief, but never erased it. Soldiers learned to continue performing duties even while carrying the weight of loss. Daily life, even in combat zones, demanded attention. Patrols, guard shifts, maintaining equipment. Men compartmentalized emotion, separating immediate tasks from the internal storm of guilt and grief. Survival became entangled with loyalty. Carrying on after a friend's death was an act of respect and necessity. A soldier could not grieve fully in the middle of combat without endangering himself and others. The act of moving forward became a testament to both personal endurance and commitment to comrades. Yet death lingered in memory. Even decades later, veterans described how they could recall exactly where a friend fell, the sound of their voice, or a shared joke from months prior. Some memories came in bursts during quiet moments, Others intruded in dreams or flashbacks. The mind refused to let go. Guilt could shape behavior in life-threatening ways. Some soldiers took unnecessary risks to avenge a fallen comrade or to prove survival. Others hesitated, paralyzed by fear of failing someone they still carried in memory. The psychological toll was invisible to outsiders but immediate and consequential in combat situations. Relief did not erase guilt. When a unit survived an engagement that claimed multiple lives, survivors often felt a mix of relief and shame. They lived, but others did not. This duality was exhausting, emotionally and mentally. The death of comrades also affected trust and group cohesion. Soldiers had to balance reliance on others with the knowledge that anyone could die at any moment. Bonds were strengthened through shared experience, but tested by loss. The ability to trust both in oneself and in one's unit was constantly challenged. Letters, journals, and conversations became lifelines. Documenting loss helped preserve memory and manage guilt. Soldiers wrote to family, to themselves, and to comrades who survived. These small acts of reflection maintained sanity in a world defined by chaos. Sometimes humor survived, even in grief. Soldiers found small ways to laugh, to joke about absurd situations, to recall a fallen friend's quirks. Humor became a tool to manage unbearable reality, a mental breathing space that helped preserve the will to continue. Yet even the strongest humor had limits. The weight of witnessing death, combined with ongoing stress, hunger, exhaustion, and danger, could overwhelm anyone. Psychological collapse was never shameful, it was natural. The ability to survive emotionally was as random and fragile as survival in combat itself. In extreme cases, survivors' guilt lasted long after the war. Men returned home physically intact, but mentally burdened. Some avoided friends or family. Some could not discuss their experiences. Nightmares and flashbacks persisted. Even decades later, the silent question remained, why me and not him? The combination of loss, fatigue, hunger, and danger created a perfect storm. Survival was no longer about moving fast, shooting straight, or following orders. It was about endurance, emotional, mental, and physical. Each day required balance. Carry on, protect yourself, honor your friends, and hope luck remained on your side. Death of comrades reshaped the understanding of courage. Bravery was not just running into fire. It was showing up the next day, performing tasks despite grief, exhaustion, and fear. It was finding small ways to maintain humanity in the middle of chaos. Heroism was often mundane. Survival was often quiet. And yet, soldiers continued, because war did not pause for grief, because missions still required completion, because, despite all, every soldier wanted to live. By the end of campaigns, many realized that surviving World War II required accepting a paradox. You could endure terrible loss, fear, and exhaustion, and still survive. You could make mistakes, carry guilt, and face randomness, and still survive. But you could not control it all. The hardest enemy was sometimes invisible, the combination of grief, guilt, and emotional exhaustion. And yet, enduring these invisible battles day after day, month after month, was what truly defined survival. In the next chapter, even after the fighting ended, danger would persist. Accidents, unexploded ordnance, lingering disease, and missteps in the chaos of victory continued to claim lives, proving that survival in war did not end with the final shot fired. For most soldiers, the thought of surviving a battle created a fragile sense of relief. The sound of gunfire stopped. The enemy no longer advanced. Artillery fell silent. For a few moments, the world seemed to breathe alongside them. But relief in war is temporary, and survival does not end when the last bullet is fired. Even after the fighting ended, danger remained constant. The battlefield did not forgive mistakes. It did not pause for exhaustion or grief. Unexploded ordnance littered the ground shells, mines, grenades that had failed to detonate during combat. Every step had to be considered. One wrong move could trigger death instantly. Soldiers learned to walk carefully, almost reverently, as if the earth itself had teeth. Accidents became common. Men slipped on mud-slick terrain while carrying heavy equipment. Vehicles overturned on roads still crated from artillery. A misfired weapon, a dropped pack, or a poorly secured supply load could cause injuries as severe as those inflicted by enemy fire. In many units, post-battle casualties rivaled combat losses in frequency. The environment continued to fight back. Flooded trenches, muddy roads, and unstable buildings remained hazards, Soldiers who survived the bullets often succumbed to slips, falls, or crush injuries when surveying destroyed towns or damaged infrastructure. Even crossing a stream could be dangerous if the current was strong or if debris lurked beneath the surface. Nature did not discriminate. Disease did not respect the end of combat either. Men who had barely survived tropical jungles, European winters, or North African deserts remained vulnerable. Malaria, dysentery, influenza, and infections continued to take their toll. Medical facilities were often overwhelmed. Soldiers weakened by months of fighting, inadequate rations, and exhaustion were particularly susceptible. Illness could strike quietly, sometimes weeks after the official fighting had ceased. Supply chains lagged behind. Even when areas were secured, delivering food, clean water, and medical supplies remained difficult. Roads destroyed by bombing, vehicles immobilized in mud, and the sheer number of men needing support meant rations were inconsistent. Soldiers continued to scavenge, improvise, and ration in ways similar to those they had practiced during active fighting. Psychological stress did not vanish. The relief of battle's end often collided with the reality of loss. Soldiers faced piles of debris, abandoned weapons, and bodies, both enemy and friendly. Survivors' guilt persisted. Memories of the firefights, the screams, and the chaos remained vivid. The mind, trained for months on survival, struggled to relax in this new quiet environment. Friendly fire became a significant threat. Even in post-combat zones, confusion remained. Miscommunication, misidentification, and hurried movements could result in tragic accidents. Soldiers who thought themselves safe suddenly became vulnerable, learning that the rules of caution never stopped applying. Minefields and booby traps lingered. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear them, but the task was monumental. Many men stepped unknowingly into danger. Flags, markers, and cleared paths helped, but perfection was impossible. One miscalculation could be fatal. Survival required constant vigilance. Even during cleanup operations, rest remained elusive. Sleep, though slightly easier without immediate gunfire overhead, was still interrupted. Soldiers kept watches. They slept lightly, aware that explosions or distant gunfire could signal danger. The body remained tense. Adrenaline lingered in the bloodstream. Mental fatigue compounded physical exhaustion. Returning equipment added stress. Weapons, packs, and supplies still needed maintenance. Clothing and boots were damaged. Soldiers repaired gear in improvised ways, knowing that functioning equipment could be the difference between life and death during an unexpected skirmish or sudden accident. Local civilians presented new challenges. Occupied towns or recently liberated villages offered both opportunities and hazards. Food, shelter, and information could be found, but so could hidden dangers, booby traps, hostile inhabitants, and diseases carried unknowingly. Trust had to be calibrated carefully, yet interactions were often necessary for survival. Psychological decompression was uneven. Some men began to relax slightly, joking, talking, or seeking comfort. Others remained tense, scanning for threats, replaying battles, and worrying about the next danger. The disparity among soldiers created additional challenges for cohesion and morale. Evacuation and reassignment did not guarantee safety. Troops were often moved to new areas quickly. Training camps, occupation zones, and preparation for future campaigns required soldiers to remain alert. Every new assignment introduced unknown terrain, unfamiliar allies, and unexpected threats. Survival depended on adaptability, observation, and cautious optimism. Accidents at supply depots and transport hubs were common. Loading and unloading trucks, rail cars, and ships involved heavy, unwieldy cargo. Mishaps could crush, burn, or electrocute soldiers. Even in areas far from front lines, the danger never fully vanished. Soldiers learned to respect equipment and follow protocols meticulously to phase consequences. Medical care still determined outcomes. Men who survived wounds, infections, or exhaustion depended on field hospitals, evacuation centers, and rear area facilities. Delays in treatment could turn minor injuries into permanent disabilities. Survival was often as much a matter of timing as skill or luck. Weather continued to exact a toll. Floods, storms, and heat waves did not wait for official declarations of victory. Soldiers endured blistering sun, freezing nights, and relentless rain while rebuilding camps, patrolling, or maintaining supply routes. Physical resilience remained essential, even outside combat. Emotional endurance became central. Soldiers confronted lingering grief, anxiety, and trauma. Friends lost, nights spent in fear, and countless narrow escapes accumulated into invisible scars. Mental resilience dictated how soldiers adapted to the post-combat environment and the return to relative safety. Routines helped preserve sanity. Even small rituals, checking gear, cleaning weapons, maintaining personal hygiene, or sharing meals provided structure and control. These routines, practiced during combat, became lifelines in the unpredictable post-battle world. They reminded soldiers that, despite randomness and danger, certain aspects of life could be managed. Small victories mattered. Receiving mail, a hot meal, a functioning radio, or even a friendly interaction provided psychological boosts that countered fatigue and stress. Soldiers learned to appreciate fleeting comfort. Such moments reinforced the idea that survival extended beyond the battlefield. It was also about enduring life in its totality during war. Adaptation was continuous. Surviving the end of combat required a new skill set. Soldiers had to navigate terrain, manage fatigue, maintain vigilance, handle equipment, cope with lingering illness, and manage mental stress, all while anticipating new threats that could appear without warning. Every day became an exercise in endurance and judgment. Luck remained an unpredictable force. Just as in combat, random events could decide life or death. A sudden explosion in a supply depot, a roof collapse in a bombed-out building, a misstep in an unstable trench. Soldiers depended on attentiveness, preparation, and experience, but always understood that fate played a role beyond human control. Reintegration of units posed challenges. Groups that had survived together were sometimes split, with soldiers sent to new assignments or home. Rebuilding trust, adapting to new comrades, and adjusting routines all tested mental and physical resilience. Units learned to balance past experiences with present demands. Even after victory celebrations, danger lingered. Weapons training, accidents, fires, collapsing structures, or transport mishaps continued to claim lives. Soldiers who thought safety had returned were reminded that war did not respect timing or expectations. Survival required humility, patience, and constant awareness. In essence, the end of combat was not the end of risk. The battlefield became a landscape of ongoing hazards, invisible, quiet, and relentless. Soldiers had to maintain alertness while navigating uncertainty, managing fatigue, and coping with emotional stress. The skills that kept them alive during active fighting remained necessary, though they were now applied to subtler, less dramatic threats. Survival after combat was often more psychological than physical. Confidence returned slowly. Relief was tentative. Men carried scars that could not be treated with bandages or morphine. Sleep was fragile. Hunger remained intermittent. Fatigue persisted. The mind constantly weighed memory, loss, and fear. Soldiers had survived combat, but now faced the challenge of surviving themselves. Even small miscalculations could be fatal. The body, exhausted and weakened, did not forgive slips in attention. Soldiers learned to move carefully, maintain routines, and respect danger in forms that were not obvious. A hidden shell, an infected wound, a sudden illness. Life depended on vigilance as much as courage. The post-combat period became a final test. It measured endurance, judgment, and adaptability under conditions less dramatic but equally deadly. Survival was no longer measured in seconds during firefights, but in hours and days while navigating unpredictability. For the soldier, it became clear, survival in World War II was not a single heroic act. It was a cumulative process. Day by day, hour by hour, step by step, the soldier navigated bullets, weather, exhaustion, hunger, injury, disease, grief, and chance. Each decision, no matter how small, contributed to staying alive. Victory did not erase the need for vigilance. Every landscape held hidden dangers. Every routine required attention. Every moment carried uncertainty. The end of combat was merely a transition, not a conclusion. The war's hazards persisted in quiet, insidious ways, and for many soldiers, it was only after the shooting stopped that the true weight of survival became clear. They had endured bullets, shells, hunger, exhaustion, and grief but to survive entirely. They had to endure the aftermath, the waiting, the danger that lingered, and the silent, unrelenting pressure of living on after death surrounded them. In the next chapter, we will follow these men home, where survival faced a new battlefield, reintegration into a world that had continued without them, while their bodies, minds, and spirits bore the invisible marks of endurance. Returning home after surviving World War II was not a simple relief. For the soldiers who endured years of fear, hunger, wounds, exhaustion, and grief, stepping back into civilian life was like entering a world that had moved on without them. Streets were quieter, towns seemed smaller, and the rhythm of everyday life was unfamiliar. Victory parades and celebrations could not erase the months or years of trauma carried in every step, every thought, and every scar. The journey home itself was often disorienting. Troop transports, crowded trains, and ships brought soldiers back, but the environment was unfamiliar. No longer a battlefield, no longer facing immediate danger. Men confronted quiet spaces that felt alien after months of chaos. Soldiers were packed in alongside others who had endured similar horrors, yet each carried unique experiences and unseen wounds. Sleep on the journey remained fitful, and exhaustion clung to their bodies like a second uniform. Even familiar landscapes felt different. Homes, streets, and neighborhoods seemed smaller or oddly still. The world had continued without them, and yet they had changed in ways no one else could see. Friends, family, and neighbors often celebrated survival with joy, but the soldiers themselves felt dissonance. Their minds carried images and experiences impossible to share fully, even with those who had waited at home. Physical changes were immediate. Some soldiers returned limping or with visible scars from wounds, burns, or injuries. Others had lost weight, strength, or stamina. Long periods of malnutrition, disease, or exhaustion left their bodies altered. Everyday tasks that civilians took for granted, climbing stairs, carrying groceries, lifting a child, could feel difficult or even painful. The body had survived war, but it was not the same body that had left. Invisible wounds were even more pervasive. Nightmares, flashbacks, and hypervigilance haunted soldiers. Loud noises, sudden movements, or crowded spaces could trigger memories of gunfire, explosions, or fallen comrades. Ordinary life felt unpredictable, even though it was far safer than any battlefield. Soldiers developed habits learned for survival in combat, checking corners, keeping gear ready, scanning environments that seemed out of place at home but were impossible to shake. Mental adaptation took time. The mind had been trained to endure extremes, fear, exhaustion, and constant vigilance. Returning to civilian life required unlearning these survival instincts while retaining enough alertness to manage day-to-day life. Many veterans described feeling out of sync with the world, unable to relate to people who had not shared the same experiences. Small annoyances could trigger frustration. Ordinary stressors could feel overwhelming. Relationships changed. Family and friends often tried to help, but they could not fully understand the soldiers' experiences. Conversations about home or work could feel trivial in contrast to memories of combat. Veterans sometimes withdrew, struggling to connect with those who had remained safe. Spouses and children could provide comfort, but also inadvertently highlight the distance that war had created. Silence about experiences was common. Many veterans did not speak openly about their wartime experiences. Talking could be painful, exhausting, or impossible. Letters written during the war captured fragments, but post-war discussion often remained minimal. The stories of survival, of fear, of comrades lost, became private. Silence became a coping mechanism, a way to manage grief and guilt that could not be fully resolved. Even routine tasks required negotiation with the past. Driving a car could trigger memories of armored vehicles or artillery explosions. Walking through a crowded market might feel chaotic and threatening after months of moving cautiously through combat zones. Noise, movement, and unexpected changes in environment could provoke sudden stress, startling, or hyper-awareness. The body and mind remained conditioned to survive war, even when it was no longer necessary. Work presented both challenge and relief. Returning to old jobs or starting new ones offered a structure similar to military routine, but civilian work rarely demanded the same physical and mental endurance. Some men struggled to adapt to repetitive low-stakes tasks after years of life-or-death decisions. Others thrived, finding satisfaction in stability, productivity, and small accomplishments that had been impossible in war. Friendships evolved differently. Those who survived together often remained bonded for life. Shared trauma created connections that were deeper than ordinary friendships. Yet, reconnecting with old friends who had not experienced war could be difficult. Conversations about the past could feel alienating or unproductive, leaving veterans isolated in a world that had moved on. Emotional scars persisted. Even decades later, veterans described lingering guilt for surviving when others had died. Survivors' guilt never fully disappeared. Men mourned friends silently, often without acknowledging it openly. Holidays, anniversaries, or family gatherings could trigger memories, nostalgia, or sorrow. Emotional endurance remained essential long after physical threats had passed. Sleep continued to be elusive. Nightmares replayed combat vividly. Some men developed insomnia, others found it difficult to relax, even in safe environments. Sleeping through a night without waking to imagined threats became an achievement. For many, rest was never fully restorative, and hypervigilance persisted unconsciously. The impact on identity was profound. Soldiers returned home forever altered. The men who left were not the same as the men who returned. Wartime experiences, fear, endurance, loss, adaptation became part of who they were. Civilian life could feel mundane, yet they carried with them lessons in resilience, patience, and resourcefulness that civilians rarely understood. Health challenges lingered. Wounds left scars, infections caused lingering weakness, and diseases contracted during service required ongoing care. Mental health struggles, anxiety, depression, PTSD were often untreated or misunderstood. Survival meant living with both visible and invisible consequences. Even when safety was achieved, the world remained different. Soldiers who had survived faced a society that had changed during their absence. Advances in technology, cultural shifts, and altered economic conditions created dissonance. Veterans had to navigate a world that was simultaneously familiar and alien, all while coping with personal trauma. The experience shaped perspective. Many veterans reported a newfound appreciation for ordinary life. A hot meal, quiet evenings, family laughter, simple walks. These small pleasures, once taken for granted, were now deeply meaningful. Survival taught patience, endurance, and a quiet gratitude for moments often overlooked. Support networks became crucial. Families, veteran organizations, and community groups helped men reintegrate. Sharing experiences, however partially, provided validation and connection. Knowing others had endured similar challenges offered comfort. Even casual camaraderie with fellow veterans helped rebuild a sense of normalcy. Yet some struggled endlessly. Not all could adapt fully. Isolation, recurring trauma, or persistent guilt created long-term challenges. Life after survival was sometimes a new battlefield, requiring as much endurance and resilience as the combat zones they had left behind. Despite all this, returning home marked a final chapter in survival. It was no longer about bullets, explosions, or enemy fire, but about navigating the aftermath, rebuilding identity, restoring health, managing memory, and reconnecting with a world that had not known the cost of survival firsthand. Victory, in this sense, was complicated. The war had ended, but its effects were permanent. Surviving meant carrying lessons, scars, and memories that would shape the rest of a lifetime. The ability to adapt, endure, and persist became the true measure of survival far beyond the battlefield itself. For many, coming home was both triumph and trial. They had endured fear, fatigue, hunger, wounds, grief, and chaos. They had survived battles and accidents, disease and exhaustion, mental strain and emotional collapse. They had lost friends and carried guilt, and yet they returned. They rebuilt, adapted, and lived on. Survival was not heroic in the dramatic sense. It was patient, continuous, and quiet. It was lived in small, deliberate acts over months and years until life resumed its fragile rhythm. In the end, survival was more than escaping death. It was learning to live after experiencing the constant threat of it, maintaining humanity, and navigating a world forever changed by war. Returning home meant facing new challenges with the same resilience, endurance, and quiet courage that had carried soldiers through bullets, disease, hunger, and fear. It was the final battlefield and one that required a lifetime to navigate. And that brings us to the end of today's journey through World War II. After seeing the exhaustion, fear, discipline, and courage that defined daily life for American soldiers, one question still lingers. Do you think you would have survived? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What part of a soldier's life do you think would have been the hardest for you? We love hearing your perspectives and reading every response. If this video helped you relax, learn, or see history in a new way, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps keep these calm, immersive history stories coming. And before you go, Check out the videos on screen now for more fascinating stories from World War II and beyond, perfect for unwinding, learning, and drifting into the past. Thank you for watching, take care, and we'll see you in the next Calm History for Sleep.